All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGrosse. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I get a chance to speak to someone I'm very excited to have this conversation. His name is Matt Black, and he is got a hell of a resume. He is one of the original founding members of Coldcut, one of the originators of the Ninja Tune label. He has been involved in countless little software projects, including something that was just recently released called JammPro. We're going to be talking about that a little bit in our conversation. But a tremendous history and a tremendous amount of a tremendous head full of resources that we're going to kind of dig into. So with that, and with no more talking, I'd like to say hi to Matt. Hey, Matt, how's it going?
Yeah, very good, Darwin. Glad to be here and glad to have a chance to talk to a techno-savvy audience.
Yeah, well, that is definitely true. I mean, this is going to be a group of people that will want to dive in deep. So I know from reading a lot of your bio material, you are one of us. You definitely have a lot, your arms around a lot of technology, as well as art and music. And so with that, why don't we just have you describe a little bit about what you're in the middle of right now? What is your focus right now?
My focus right now really is the JammPro app, but we have launched it. And this is sort of the latest stage in, I could say, a 25-year development project to make a new type of electronic music instrument. So now I've reached a kind of milestone stage because the new version is the best realization of these ideas and its evolution so far. And so it's out there and I want to promote it. And also I want to use it. I want to have perhaps a little bit stop being a developer and start being a musician. I've sort of straddled that boundary quite unevenly sometimes. And this part of this trip has been to build the instrument that I want and to share it. But I want to use it to make music. And I've started doing that. So I'm now in a good position. I think I've got the instrument I want. Obviously, could develop it a lot further still. But I want to use it and get involved with a lot of collaborations with people, hopefully spread the excitement of this instrument. We've also just finished our new Coldcut album. Well, it's a Coldcut project with a collaboration with a bunch of musicians from South Africa, London, and others around the world. And the name of that is Kella Kettler, and that is going to be released in June. I think it's possibly the best thing I've done for years. It's all real music with real musicians, and John and me have been more in a producer role. But it's now done, dusted, and was mastered. I think the vinyl's being mastered on Thursday. We've actually finished it, and that's going to come out in June, and I'm pretty excited about that. So that's going to be our next music to promote. I've also just recently released another project, which is the Ninja Tune's first hardware unit, the Zen Delay, which is a stereo tube distortion, delay, and filter unit that we've made as a collaboration with Erica Synths. Right. So that's kind of a bit of a baby of mine and my mate Dr. Walker, who used to be in Air Liquide. So that's out. So these are three projects I've been working on for quite a while. And a couple of years ago, I decided to just pull back a little bit on starting off loads and loads of crazy ideas and actually finish off some of the ones which I'd started. And the last 2 or 3 years, I've got a few things actually out the door, which I'm sure you can relate to that thing of like the excitement of starting something, but then finishing it off can be a bit more of a grind, and the temptation sometimes to jump onto that new idea, get that new serotonin rush,
yes.
and get on that train. But it is good to finish things. Invention is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration, as someone's once said. So I actually have got a clear table to work on at the moment. Having said that, I believe that we're destroying the environment. We're about to rush off the edge of a cliff to destruction of humanity and the planet with quite some plausible scenarios of disaster there. And I also want to have more time to work on activism to try and contribute whatever granule of positivity I can towards a better outcome for that. So that's something that's ongoing, and sort of a main focus of mine at the moment is that as well, with Extinction Rebellion and various other projects.
That's really interesting you mentioned that, because certainly political activism, instead of just political awareness, political activism is actually really starting to become kind of a norm among artists. And so it's something I'm going to want to actually talk about more extensively in a bit, because I think that you have a long history of living that. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about those experiences. But before we go on, I want to talk about this latest app, the JammPro app. To what extent is that kind of an extension of the Ninja Jamm product? And to what extent do you feel like it's a brand new thing?
It's very much an extension of Ninja Jamm,
okay.
as I say. But that in itself is part of a 25-year development trail. In the mid-90s, we did various pieces of multimedia software, and there was a program we developed called Jam, also with two M's, and that was kind of the forerunner of Ninja Jamm and JammPro. That was a 4-track loop mixer, quite similar concept. It just happened to run. We wanted to use it for our live shows. We wanted a way to work more with loops and samples that was more true to the kind of sampling and cut-up aesthetic. So that ran on a PC laptop. We ran it on Windows NT, actually, because that was the only operating system that was stable enough to use it. Running NT on the laptop was quite hardcore, but we got it working. And we did many shows using that. And the other companion piece of software, which was VJam, which was our sort of audiovisual sampler. So both Ninja Jamm and JammPro go back to that sort of original loop engine idea, which we sort of first realized in the mid-90s. First versions were written in direct Macromind Director, actually. And then I found some coders, actually the preferred term software engineers nowadays, isn't it? A bit more respectful. My mate Kamart from Cambridge, a bunch of Buddhists who taught themselves coding and got into, being programmers and making some pretty cool stuff. So I met them at the Big Chill Festival, and it was with them that I cooked up these initial instruments, which were weirdly written in Delphi, which is sort of Visual Pascal, not the most obvious language, but
yeah, you know what? That's where I did an awful lot of Delphi work over the years, so I know it was actually a really great environment to work in. So there you go.
Yeah, so those guys were my initial crew of software engineers, and then what happened was I got a deal with Steinberg, in fact, to develop this, and they even gave me an advance, but it didn't work out. I couldn't keep the project together. This was the late 90s and early noughties, and it stalled out, and I was very upset because I knew what I wanted to do. And then Ableton came out, and I was like, okay, well, these guys have done something pretty amazing. I guess I'll jump onto that. So I did. So I've been using that for a few years. And then when Apple launched the iPhone and the App Store, I thought, hey, there's an opportunity here, because not only is this an amazing platform in terms of hardware, but also the ability to get something, make an app and get it out there and distribute it worldwide on the net was a fantastic way to jump over the bottlenecks of physical distribution, which had been a sticking point for us before.
Sure.
So it took me a while to, get my head together and get a team and get on track. But in 2013, with these guys, SEPA from London, we released Ninja Jamm, and that was the next sort of milestone after Jam. And I slightly cockily, I said I wanted to create the world's most advanced beat instrument and give it away. And we did that. I think it is pretty advanced. And unfortunately, I wanted to do it as a make your own music thing, but I was persuaded, well, I should take the responsibility. We didn't make the right decision. We pitched it more as a remix Ninja Tunes kind of thing.
Yeah.
And what we found was, yes, there are a small number of people that are into remixing, but in terms of people that are into electronic music and savvy enough to use an app and want to do something, actually they want to make their own track. So really, the ability to load your own samples and just use it in a much more free-form way was what people wanted. So I realized that, and actually that was what I wanted as well. And it took another 7 years to get a great team together and deliver the next incarnation, which is JammPro. And along the way, of course, we picked up a lot more functionality. And indeed, we still have a long feature list, but we've packed a lot more into the app this time round. And if you've had a look,
I have. I got a chance to play. I got a chance to play with it this weekend. Yeah. And my God, I ended up hitting that help button an awful lot because it is chock full of stuff. Now, luckily, if if you kind of just like take a step back and allow yourself not to have to know everything, but are willing to just play with something like the cut playback or just the drill and filter combination on a little slider.
Yeah.
You can have an awful lot of fun with that, but I would say that when I played with Ninja Jamm, I was like, okay, this is a fun tool for playing around, and I can imagine using it for fun remix like games, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah.
This JammPro feels like a friggin' instrument. It feels like an instrument in that it clearly is going to take some time to master it.
Yeah.
It clearly is going to support you building up a library of tracks to work with it.
Yeah.
It has all of those kind of all those kind of affects to it that make it seem very instrument-like.
I'm glad to hear it. I mean, that is very much the aim to do that. There's a lot you can do with Ninja Jamm. And in fact, I've done quite a few workshops where I get together with a bunch of heads and say, okay, let's make a pack for Ninja Jamm. And I've been some very enjoyable workshops, and I've met some great people doing that. So, it is possible to make your own packs for Ninja Jamm, but it's not as easy as just being able to load your own samples into it. And so by making that a lot easier to do, I think we've opened it up. And then, yes, I very much wanted to put in more performance and instrument style functionality to it. I mean, over the years, we've only just released this version, but I've had the dev version on my iPad for a good 3 or 4 years, and I've used it for shows all that time, on and off. In fact, there's another secret function which we haven't revealed in the manual yet, but it can do MIDI out.
Oh wow!
So I use that. I do audiovisual shows with Coldcut, and also my wife Dinaz, she's a filmmaker, and we do shows together as well. Audiovisual shows where Ninja Jamm JammPro is providing the sound triggering, but each sound element and each effect sends out a MIDI stream, and we hook that up to Resolume.
Right.
So, and we make similar layouts for each track as we have in Jamm. So we have 4 tracks of visuals plus a 5th track for stabs, and then a bunch of effects per channel effect. And the clips are triggered from Jamm so that each sound clip is assigned a visual clip. You get the BPM clock as well. You set each visual clip to be a certain number of bars. And it's amazing what a tight sync you can get out of it using that technique. And then also audiovisual effects, so that if I move, say, the delay XY around, that will also send out a controller stream to Resolume, and I can have assigned, say, a video feedback effect.
Right.
I would think that video feedback is kind of the visual analogy of delay.
Yeah.
So I like creating those kind of relationships. So we can do a full audiovisual show based on Jamm as well.
That's really keen. Now, one question though, given the level of detail that you put into this, why do it on the iPad? Why wouldn't you make something that runs on a laptop or something that sort of like seems to be, quote, beefy enough to like do this heavy lifting? It seems like what you've done is kind of really built something that is more complicated than we're used to seeing on an iPad for sure.
Well, personally, I find the iPad and the iPad Pro, which I've got, which is the big meaty size one, a great interface. I mean, in a word, the answer is touch. I like touch control. I like the fact that when I'm looking at the interface and I'm seeing my clips, I've got my clips named, and I touch them, my eye, my ear, and my brain and my hand are all linked together in one interface. Now, I don't really get that with a laptop.
Right.
So to me, it's actually a step forward in terms of an instrument interface. So I do find it a great interface. I mean, ideally, I would have, pressure sensitivity on the touch screen as well for another degree of freedom. In fact, Apple did do what they called 3D touch, I think it was, on a bunch of the phones, but it didn't really take off. And they haven't done it on the iPad. If they did, I would jump onto that, and that would give it another level of expression as well. But what we call the tip control, the way that you can use small finger movements to control effects, I think is quite a good halfway house. I was surprised. I sort of had the idea and then tried it. It's actually very expressive. It doesn't all have to be about big hand and finger movements. You can be quite subtle about it, and you then You can tune into that movement and use your ears to decide how much you want to affect the sound. There is a version of a Jam which is desktop, but it's our dev version, which the devs use to test and build stuff before then building it for the iPad.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
We have considered making a laptop or desktop version, and it's something that we would consider if we felt there was a demand for it. So that's not out of the question at all. The original, like I say, DJam version was a 4-channel clip mixer. We used the QWERTY keys to trigger the clips. There's just enough. You can just about get enough keys off the keyboard to do that.
Right.
But things like, the XY and particularly the drillter and so on, you can't do that on a computer interface. You need a controller.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
No, I use Ableton. I've got my push. I like it, but I'm sort of half looking at my push, then half looking at the screen. My attention's split, whereas with Jam, it's all in one place. So I find that pretty natural.
Yeah, well, it is interesting, too. I think that with things like, I think you called it the drillter, the combination of the filter and the drill.
Yeah.
I think most people when they're designing the software would say, that's too subtle of a movement. You're not going to be able to get a sense of precision. It's not going to work, or you're not going to get the right kind of feedback. But you've done something there, which is, it just feels right. And the way that you get the little visualizer on the top left means that if I want visual confirmation of what I'm doing, it's there, but it also doesn't take over the whole UI. But also just the amount that of movement it takes to make stuff happen. I thought you did a brilliant job of that. That was really fantastic.
Well, thank you very much. I'm quite happy with that, and I enjoy using it. Like you say, it feels quite natural, and it was a surprise that one could get a real natural expression out of that. So that one worked out pretty well. Thank you.
Well, and good for you as a designer to be able to use your own things. Sometimes when you have these multi-year development processes, by the time it actually gets time to release it, you're so sick of the product you don't even want to see it anymore, right?
No, I've kept my excitement. I like nothing better than, getting high and then sitting on the iPad for a few hours just jamming away, frankly.
Yeah, that sounds like a way to make a living right there.
It's my ambition to get paid for doing that, basically. So I sort of got there in the end. So, yeah,
I love it. So one of the things I like doing in my podcast is talking to people about their background and how they got to be the artist or creator or maker that they are. In your case, you kind of really do span all different kinds of things. I mean, there's the artistic side of you, which is expressed in Coldcut and the other musical projects that you're involved in. There's sort of like the businessman that has to exist in order to keep Ninja Tune running and having kept it running for ages. There's the developer maker side of you that is constantly developing software, designing software, working with other developers to do all this stuff. I'm curious what your background is, how you got sucked into each of these disciplines, and what were the influences that really kind of helped you define who you'd become?
Wow. Well, I mean, that's a big question. It's funny enough, I'm actually writing a little piece for The Wire magazine about some of my influences and epiphanies, actually, moments where I sort of, something shifted because of some information or experience that I had. I can say I was dealt a pretty good hand, actually. My mum and dad were well-educated people. My grandfather on my dad's side was a neurologist and a professor of neurology. My mum's father was an architect and designer called Wells Coates, who's one of the sort of recently been sort of reevaluated as one of the leading lights of the modern movement in architecture and design. He was a friend of Le Corbusier's. He died before I was born, but I always felt his influence quite strongly. And my mum and dad always encouraged my sister and I in all things artistic, and also to read and enjoy knowledge. And we were, I guess, quite an intellectual family. And I got into science and science fiction at an early stage. And I was just recalling this for this piece. I remember getting the flu when I was about 7 years old, and my dad giving me an old chemistry textbook of his. And it kind of that was an epiphany. Something about those, maybe it was the alchemical symbolistic nature of all these retorts and flasks and formulas. It kind of burnt itself into my brain, and that was the start of my interest in science. I got a chemistry set later on. I started to devour as much science fiction as I could get my hands on. Then in 1975, the interest that I had in the mid-70s as an early teenager, schoolboy, I've used for the rest of my career. In fact, when I was about 9 or 10, I used to do what my mum called a sound and light show. I'd get some toy robots and some bulbs and buzzers and switches, and I'd set them all up and charge my family half a penny to come in. And my mum said, "Oh, yes, Matthew, it's a sound and light show." So that bit of maternal encouragement, I think, was quite significant.
Right.
And I was messing around with radios. I found out if I attached a motor to a battery and switched it on and off, I could hear that on the radio. That was quite interesting. And then in the mid-70s, I had a little bunch of geeky friends. We were sort of a proto-geek posse. We had a little radio station that we'd play on the intercom at school. We'd run a disco with some old equipment that we'd sort of found and repaired. And I was building a synthesizer, actually, in 1976 out of a kit in practical electronics. It was called the Mini Sonic 2. And my friend, one of my posse, he was called Aidan Sutcliffe, and he was a better electronics bod than I was. And he worked out that you could take this design that they'd given you and you could make it more complicated, more sophisticated. So the Mini Sonic was quite a simple little synthesizer, but he worked out that you could take anything and route it to anything else. Oh. And he built a sort of a patch matrix, actually, in fact, using toggle switches, about, I think, like a 10 by 10 array of toggle switches that he found a job lot of cheap. And I think that had quite a good impact on me. It's like, okay, well, you can take something and then you can adapt it and make it more sophisticated or bend it to your needs. So that was a watershed moment. And then came a couple of books. One was The Shockwave Rider by John Brunner. And this, as I found out years later, is based on Alvin Toffler's Future Shock. He was a futurist at MIT, and that book had a lot of influence. And John Brunner took it and made it into a sort of sci-fi thriller. It's credited as being the first cyberpunk book, actually.
Right.
And it describes a young, bright kid living in a sort of oligarch totalitarian state who finds that he can use the computer network to create multiple identities and fight back against the system. And I think I must have been, wow, the future's going to be like that, and I want to be that guy. So that kind of started an interest in computers, which in the mid-70s, there was no access and no information really, just the odd shred of bits of information. There was a boy at school, his dad was a programmer. I remember him telling us about a story about a program called Virus that could send itself between computers over the phone and then freeze a computer, and then you get a letter from the controllers saying, if you want to buy a program called Antibody, put this amount of money in a Swiss bank account. I thought, that sounds pretty damn cool. And but then, the idea that, maybe that sounds almost like that software is alive. That's right. Interesting. Yeah. And then came the next year, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. So I was moving in the direction of biochemistry, and that book spell out a lot of stuff to me. It provided a sort of framework for understanding how the world works. Everything's about genes expressing themselves in the environment. And it had a number of pretty mind-blowing threads, that book. Another was the computer. I don't think Dawkins explicitly said that, but I picked this up, that you could compare DNA code in base pairs with computer code in binary switches. And there was an analogy there. And I thought that was fascinating. And Dawkins then also talked about how you could use programs to run simulations of life using, for example, game theory, hawks and doves, different strategies in a virtual environment to see how they competed with each other. I just found it incredibly cool and fascinating. And then I taught myself to program with that as a motivation, really. There was a couple of demo programs in electronics magazines, and I sort of absorbed it and worked out how to program. I didn't have a computer, but I could do enough. I got the idea and then used to get the odd hour or so on a computer somewhere and started writing war games and also these game theory simulations based on the outlines the ideas Dawkins outlined in this book. So that was the huge influence. And then, of course, towards at the end of The Selfish Gene, Dawkins brings in the meme concept, that ideas he called memes can reproduce in cultural space, in information space, and can spread themselves. And I started to see everything as competition between memes and associations of memes. I think the term memeplex was coined later, but it was a framework to understand the world. And I think perhaps some of our audience can relate to this. I found interpersonal relationships difficult. I wasn't a cool kid at school. I was a bit too odd, and I was a SWAT, and that wasn't popular. And although running the disco was quite popular, that was kind of a cool. So I've worked out that you could use technology to be cool and fit in. But, the attraction of a world that was rational and logic and that I could understand and control was there. And I think for many people that, I consider myself on the spectrum. I think everyone is. But I can identify with that. And it gave me a focus and an ability to concentrate. And it's like, I know I can suss this out. I know I can do this. And I can bend it to my will. And that in a way was the start of my career in creative technology. That
was like the foundation, yeah.
Yeah.
So when was the first time that you actually got your own computer so that you could take these ideas and these things and sort of like mess around? And so, I mean, because one of the things is when you'd write out programs and you'd have to like snag an hour off of a computer at some business or something.
Yeah.
That you have to be almost kind of like dedicated to the task of trying out your idea, right? Where when personal computers first came along, and I was lucky enough to be around for that as well, there was this
When was that for you then?
For me, that would have been like around 1979, 1980.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, right.
Anciently ago. I don't see. I shouldn't even say that out loud because everybody's.
That dates us. But hey, mate, we've been around for a while, which is cool. I can say I've been using computers for 45 years.
Yeah, right.
Cool. And for me, the Commodore PET in 1979, when I left school, I got a job in a lab, and they had a PET, and I started writing programs on that.
Yeah, for me it was an Apple II Plus, but similar story, right?
Yeah.
But I remember that was what was interesting is it went from being working on a computer being like task oriented to all of a sudden when I had my own computer, I could just kind of fuck around with it, right?
Yeah.
I could just say like, I have this really stupid idea. What if I made this program where I'm running through a minefield and I just step on mines and blow up? Oh, okay. That's a really dumb game. What happens if I randomize things? What happens if I do this?
Yeah.
I could just like, and it, for a geek, programming on a personal computer was like a game where life was the game, right? I mean, I had the ability to just like come up on a whim, come up with an idea. And if I had the balls to try it and I had the time to spend on doing it, which I had ample amount of time, I could find out if it worked or not. And that was an amazing turn of events.
Totally. And I mean, it is a form of self-expression as well, which as a young person, I was hungry for. And I think that's a common thing for many people. You want to have some way to express yourself, but it might not be about, being on the football team or being the coolest kid in the class. It might be something else. There are different drives. I like to think that human society needs all kinds of personality types to work as a sort of overall organism. I mean, as well as it does work, which is a sort of beautiful mess. But, that excitement of sort of a world which you could understand and control and learn from. I mean, in a way, now I see people talking about teaching programming to kids from as young as 5.
Right.
Some people have a problem with that. And I think sometimes computers are and technology is out of balance for young people, but it definitely has an important role.
Yeah. Now, one question, though, is all of this background kind of points to a person who's going to become a really good computer programmer at an insurance company somewhere. But you didn't do that. You end
well,
up instead like falling into samplers and dance music and a whole different thing. How did that happen?
Well, it's funny. I was just writing in this article that, if things had gone along that track, I'd probably be working at GCHQ now, basically.
Right, there you go.
I mean, I did come from a sort of somewhat, my family was a mixture of sort of bohemian and liberal and quite tight-assed and conservative as well. And at school, I was into music. Music was the key to sort of not just being an accountant, I suppose, or not just taking that standard cog role.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Shockwave Rider did make the rebel idea, sold me that idea. So that was an influence. And then, in a word, once I got to university, there was another big influence, and that was drugs. I got to be candid about it. My sister turned me on to smoking a spliff, and I was never the same afterwards. I've had quite a long battle with particularly cannabis. It's a bit of a love-hate relationship because I also have suffered from depression, and sometimes that shit is not good for one's state of mind. But it did open the door to some other ways of operating and thinking and being and feeling. And, later on, LSD was a big influence as well. These are not they're not computable, the effects of those things. And because I needed something else. Otherwise, like you say, I'd have ended up at GCHQ. I'm glad that I had those experiences. And I do believe, actually, that particularly the psychedelic experience is very important. It's been very important for me. And I believe that's an important and unfairly persecuted part of human existence and humans' toolkit to evolve and grow. So that is, in a word, probably that's why I managed to swerve off that route and take another track.
Sure, that makes actually a lot of sense. Given that music was sort of like the tool that you kind of grasped onto as being sort of like the music and drugs being a combination that really sort of like was life affirming for you. It's yet another step though to dive into music technology and especially with Coldcut, your early forays into sample manipulation and stuff like that was pretty groundbreaking and kind of shocking within the context of the time. What tools were you using? I mean, were you using just like Akai samplers and stuff at that time?
Well, like everything, we just started off with what was cheap and what was to hand.
Okay, which was what?
Well, I mean, initially, so based on, some of the things I've been outlining, the synthesizer, the interest in tech, the school disco, I was always fascinated by tech and music tech. And somewhere I got the idea that, technology could be creative and computers didn't have to just be about spreadsheets. I started writing the, computer games and then, the patterns that you could make programs that would draw shit on screen. And that was pretty interesting. I think, my dad was an artist and sculptor. So I had a good mixture of art and science in my family. Well, hip hop was a big influence. And my mates and I used to have great parties. And we were really into these records coming over from New York. So we used to make these mixtapes just using a cassette to edit things together initially. Just
kind of like pause button editing,
yeah.
You mean?
Yeah, but we took it to a ridiculous extent. So we'd all sit around listening to each other's mixes going like, late. A nice environment. Me and my mates, I've got to say, that was one of the happiest times of my life, living with my buddies, getting high and getting really into music and making tapes and, a spirit of sort of positive competition with each other to see who could do the coolest mixes and stuff.
Sure.
And, that's also part of it as well, to do cool stuff. Now, where does that come from? Partly because I think one wants to be accepted. And so by doing cool stuff, then you're cool. So then you can get accepted. That's also a driver.
Right.
Before Coldcut, I got a 4-track cassette and an MTR 6x4x2 mixer, which was more flexible than a Porter Studio, actually, but basically a Porter Studio setup. I got a couple of turntables. I had a humiliating defeat on the decks in Bristol at the hands of Nelly Hooper of the Wild Bunch, who later became Massive Attack. And I got convinced to challenge him just as I thought it was a laugh, but it ended up being quite bruising. And then but it was great because after that I was like, right, fuck it, I'm going to learn to do this properly. I went straight back to London, bought my SL 1200s and started practicing until I was a scratch mix DJ. And there weren't many around at that time. This is like 1984. I also got into BPM mixing. Now, most DJs were either scratch mixers, hip hop mixers, or they were kind of disco mix club BPM mixers. I thought both were cool. Do you know who John Peel was?
Yes.
Well, John Peel had a big influence on several generations of music lovers.
Right. Everyone out of the UK ends up touching on him as being an influence.
And so we should do. So we should do, because what John did was he made it cool to be into a lot of different sorts of music. Mm-hmm. And that's been, for Jonathan, my partner, and me, was definitely a common ground. And then hip hop and scratch mixing and BPM mixing gave us a toolkit where we could be into a lot of music and we could mix that shit together and make something else out of it. Start creating, an offspring by hybridizing all these elements together. So then initially it was a 4-track cassette and decks. Then I got an MC202, which was a little Roland sequencer.
Box, yep.
Didn't have the manual. I couldn't fucking work out how to program. It drove me nuts. I couldn't get it to make a loop that would work. And then one day, by chance, I got a loop that worked. I was trying to rip off We're Rocking Down the House by Adonis, which was one of these seminal Chicago house records. This is like 1986 now. And suddenly the loop worked. Only later did I work out that you had to enter the step sequences so the lengths added up to 128, then it would loop. But I was like, my God, I've got it. I don't turn it off. Just keep it going, keep it going. And it just sounded, I'm just getting inside the sound, playing with the filter. And that became Doctorin The House, which was our first sort of big hit. So then, then I got, when we made our first record, Say Kids, What Time Is It? That was just using the 4-track and turntables and cassette editing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We got some money from that. I bought a Casio RZ drum machine, which had 0.8 of a second of sampling time on it, which was just enough to get 4 drums off James Brown Funky Drummer into it, so you could make up your own beats, up your own breaks. It was all about rare groove and breakbeat then.
Sure.
And at this time, I'd met Jonathan, who was actually a really cool, established figure on the London rare groove scene. I was nobody, but I could scratch and mix and had some good ideas. And we were like, look, we like these records from New York by Double D and Steinsky. The Lessons, they were called Lessons 1, 2, and 3.
Okay.
Let's do something like this. So I came back to him with a tape. I said, what do you think of this? He said, it's wicked. Let's put it out. So we pressed 500 copies, and that was the start of Coldcut.
Interesting. Yeah. That's how it got rolling. Very, very cool. Now, over the course of time with Coldcut, and especially then after you established the Ninja Tune label, you ended up finding yourself in a position to work with an awful lot of different performers, different producers and stuff. And it could have really easily kind of devolved into you either becoming like business guy or producer guy or marketing hype guy. But you always kind of kept your fingers in technology, right?
Well, that was the fascination, really. That John and I, it was good to make a record and put it out and people liked it and buy it and get some money. But then with that money, we just buy some more equipment.
Right.
And that's how we started. So just sketch in just the beginning of the Coldcut again a bit. After the RZ drum machine and the little sequencer, the little 202, we got an Atari 1040. And I read about this stuff and I bought C-Lab Creator.
Okay. And
this was where having a programming, I didn't mention that, when I left, I did my degree at university, but I did biochemistry, but I did a computing option in the last year, learning Pascal, funny enough. And I got a job with a programming company called Logica in London. Okay. So that was my first job. And they very generously allowed me to switch from finance, who had offered me the job. I went to an open day there and there was a guy playing video off what looked like a record. I said, how can you do that? He said, yeah, we can encode it and actually we can send video down a phone line. It's called delta compression. I was like, really? That's fucking cool. Then he showed me another thing, which was a sort of pen and tablet where you could draw on this tablet and it would come out on the screen. It was a thing they'd invented called Flare. It was like their version of Quantel Paintbox, early computer graphics.
Okay.
So I said, look, I'm really into this. And and they let me switch from finance to comms very generously. And otherwise my life would have been a lot different again. I probably made a lot of money doing banking software, but I went into the comms side, and so I learned to code, write assembler, and work on these early computer graphics stuff. So that was an important step there, which I forgot as well. But again, It was about computers. Computers can be used for creative, cool stuff. That underlines that, allowed me to follow that idea up. So then, I got C-Lab Creator, and because I had a programming environment, I'd never touched a sequencer before, but I learned to use it in a couple of hours. I got the concept, and I could start making music using a sequencer, and that was pretty damn cool. First, I just triggered the drum machine. Then I got another Casio. I think they gave us a half price sampler, the FZ1. Mm-hmm. We've always sort of slightly taken the odd route. So
right.
Most people had Akai's, but we ended up with this Casio, which was a good box actually. And I sort of always like the things that people think are not. I like something that doesn't scream professional necessarily. It's a bit left field, or you're taking a toy and you're using it for some serious purpose. First baseline we played from a sample was played on a 20 quid Casio, actually, one of the very early little samplers.
A little SK1 or something? Yeah.
Something like it could well have been an SK1. So, we always like that sort of playful attitude, and we like toy. I think that related me back to my sound and light shows when I was a kid. And, so that worked. And then we, C-Lab Creator was a whole world to get into. So once I started to penetrate that more, the possibilities were endless. And then we started making more sophisticated records. And we started getting into proper recording studios because we had a hit with Doctorin The House. This was after having put out a couple of records. Long story short, we got signed, and we had our own label initially ahead of our time. But then this indie company, Big Life, seized onto us, and they were like, "We've got this young singer, this girl, we'd like you to do stuff with her." And that was Yaz. That became Doctorin The House. Then we did The Only Way Is Up later on. And we're also drawing on Jon's skill and knowledge as a DJ and his extensive record collection as well, which had, he was really into break beats, and he was friends with Dr. Bob Jones, this amazing soul DJ. And so that brought me to a bunch of other experiences as well. And suddenly we were on top of the pops.
Wow. That's amazing. So when you would go and do live shows then, I don't know, you probably didn't want to haul your Atari C-Lab Creator combo out on a gig, right? So how did you do a show?
We did it initially from a DJing set of techniques, DJing.
Okay.
But it was a while before we would do live Coldcut shows. I mean, Top of the Pops, you just play the track. Yeah. As the euphemism is, one title, full playback, meaning you just mime to it.
Right. You smile nicely. Right.
You smile and, and you pretend to scratch or play the keyboard or whatever,
Right.
Musicians Union didn't accept DJs then. We had to register as a drummer and a keyboard player, respectively. So that was quite funny. And I respect the Musicians Union, actually. I'm not sure that DJs are musicians, or very few of them are. Someone like Kid Koala is a musician, but not everyone who plays someone else's records is a musician. And once we'd got some hits, there was a request that there was an opportunity to do live shows that were more than just DJing. And I've sort of looked back on it now, and in retrospect, I can kind of see the bigger picture. And it was this. We didn't want to just DJ because that was a bit boring and you couldn't really do that much. We didn't want to take the studio on the road with us, apart from the 1040 in your C-Lab, which would be bound to crash. And,
right.
What was really the point of playing a bunch of sequences? Anyway, we'd have had to take the SSL desk with us as well, which is like, £250,000 setup, because the studio records we made on an SSL. So really you needed that. And then, well, why not take the 2-inch with you as well? But then, what are you actually doing? And it just wouldn't be practical. Another approach would be, okay, let's hire a band. They can learn all these songs, which started off as a bunch of samples, and then we can go out as a band. And I remember, I love Massive Attack. I rate Unfinished Sympathy as probably the single greatest track of our epoch, actually, the electronic epoch. And I know those guys when they were the Wild Bunch, but I remember seeing them in New York when they were just starting off, and they did a sort of scrappy decks and a bit of effects and people singing on top show and some samplers, and it wasn't very good. And they obviously realized this because they went back, and the next show they came out with was Massive Attack, the band, and that's been very successful, and it's a format that's worked for them. But I wanted something else. I wanted something that was more related to the aesthetic and techniques of sampling and hip hop and cut
Right.
up.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, we need to build something to do this. And that was the sort of genesis of what's now JammPro. And as I was saying before, we had various usable prototypes of that from the mid-90s so that we could take our material. And I think we were probably one of the first electronic bands to recognize the use of stems. So I was like, okay, we're in the studio, we've mixed down the stereo mix. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go to each track and we're going to mix down the EQ'd, compressed, affected version of that as a separate track. And then we'll have those afterwards that we can do stuff with if we want to remix them. And then we worked out that we could take that, chop that into a set of loops, which could fit into the kind of memory and capacity of a laptop that was around at that time, which was, not very much, but reduce it to a set of loops so that you could then recreate that track live, but that you weren't fixed to a timeline, you weren't fixed to a structure. You had the elements there and you could remix them, mash them, improvise with them in quite a flexible way. And so that was the genesis of this type of instrument. We wanted to be able to perform our own tracks live in a flexible way that wasn't boring and was more true to the hip hop and sampling aesthetic.
Sure. And is that what then ended up becoming DJam?
Yes, exactly. So once we got our stems, we could load them into first this primitive sort of Macromind director on the name check Rob Pepperell and Miles Visman, who were two guys I worked with at the time as Hex, which was kind of Coldcut's multimedia research arm. And we built these bits of software. And then later on, I met Camart. And I said, look, I designed it, they built it, and then we kept iterating that through Ninja Jamm, through JammPro, through quite some art installation stuff that was also some prototypes. We did a piece called Generator for Glasgow Gallery of Modern Art. We did another called Synopticon for the Barbican. And these were audiovisual mixers that sort of took what we were doing with AV and put it into an interactive console format. I should say as well that, along the way, this is part of another important strand. It's like, okay, so we're going to go on stage with our laptops and our loops, and we're going to improvise. But that might not be very interesting to look at. Let's put some visuals up on a big screen that go with the music. We did not invent this idea. Visuals and music have gone together since Leonardo da Vinci, in fact, but certainly since the 60s with Warhol and the Velvets, Pink Floyd. And, you see these old posters. Jimi Hendrix with Joshua Light Show used to get equal billing virtually with the main star. I could go on about where those influences came from. Jon also was really into visuals. He used to teach 3D design. He used to do things like collect old 50s shoeboxes, and because they had an interesting texture, that was the cover of Doctorin The House, with a bit of shoebox from Jon's collection, this funky psychedelic blue and orange pattern. And the idea that, visuals, you could sample visuals as well.
I mean, you mentioned working with Camart for the development of DJam. Where I ran across the name Camart was in tracking down VJam, which I remember as being sort of like that brain twister of like, oh my God, everything that people are doing with like an MPC, you're now able to kind of do with visuals as well. And that was kind of a game changer at the time.
Well, you got it. I mean, that was exactly what we were trying to do. And for rewind to 1988, we've had some hits. I've got a bit more money. I go to Selfridges and I see an Amiga computer with the Juggler demo on it. You know that demo?
Yes, I do. Absolutely, yeah.
And I'm like, right, that means you could make a film on a desktop computer. I want. So I got myself, it was literally like that. I got myself a 2000. You could get a thing called a Video Amiga. It was only 40 quid. It was a frame grabber. You could sample visuals with it. Yes, only 12 seconds in black and white, but it was a start. With Deluxe Paint, you could take in samples from that and you could draw on top of them and you could make your own visuals. There were demo discs around from people. The demo scene was hot on the Amiga and Atari.
Yeah.
You know that scene? That was art, man. And it's not enough recognized. That was a whole art form in itself. People doing audiovisual art in code on a floppy disk on these desktop machines, just maxing it out, packing it in and doing incredible stuff, which, was part of where we are today with computer graphics and electronic art and music. It's not sufficiently recognized. Hats off to those people who did that. And I didn't code myself. I'd sort of stopped coding by now, but I was more into designing stuff, and I'd collect stuff like that. And then, I might record out a nice demo and I'd put it onto a VHS tape, and then I'd start VJing. By the mid-90s, I was VJing at gigs as well. So sometimes we'd do a squat party and Morris would be there and Aphex Twin would be there, and there'd be music, and I would do visuals along with it. I took a projector along, fired the projector up, again, an office projector.
Right, of course.
for business demonstrations. And that could blast out some psychedelic visuals, and people were quite into it, actually. Sometimes people just ignore it, but then sometimes, especially with a tripped out audience, you'd look up and you'd see you'd really got people's attention with the visuals, and it sunk in for actually a while later, just as a DJ and VJ, what responsibility you had to provide something good, some good nutrition, because people were in a very suggestible state a lot of the time at parties. And so you wanted to give them something good and beautiful and ideally positive and inspiring. So that was part of the trip as well. But yeah, the Amiga was a big step for me, realizing that, okay, well, what we've done with sampling and electronic music, we can apply a lot of that to visuals as well. And that proved a very, very fruitful vector to take. First, just mixing visuals along with music, then trying to synchronize it together, then with a program like Premiere, being able to actually assemble video and audio on a timeline, needing something like the Video Vision Radius card.
Right. Oh, Jesus, I forgot about that.
Well, that was an audiovisual sampler on the Mac.
Right.
And there was a guy called James Stevens, who is a very interesting sort of cyber activist guy. He started we were in this big warehouse near London Bridge, Ninja Tune, and a bunch of other interesting startups. And downstairs was Backspace, which was the first public access cyber cafe in London, run by James Stevens. Okay. And he used to get cheap Mac gear, and he sold us this a Quadra 840 AV and this board. So then I was working with Stuart. We formed this Hexstatic identity together. I gave Stuart that and a bunch of nature tapes. And the EBN showreel, let's hear it for Emergency Broadcast Network from New York. They were the first people in my book to do modern digital AV cut up. And it's like, let's do something like that. Respect to America for culturally leading the way. I mean, and a sob for the state of the country at the moment. But a lot of my heroes come from America, and a lot of the culture that's formed my life, whether it was Marvel Comics or hip hop or audiovisual cut up. A good bit of cultural dance and exchange and sex between London and New York, and lots of other places as well. But that's one access it's been particularly fruitful for me. But yeah, hey, we can do this with visuals and we can combine it with music, and that would be really fucking cool. That was a big new epiphany as well. So I got on that, and I've been on that for the last 25 years as well.
Right on. Well, but that also, again, led you into the path that you're implementing still today, which is this role of software developer, right?
Yeah.
Back then it was making stuff that could barely work on a desktop computer, Now it's jamming as much as you can into an iPad Pro. And in a way, it's kind of full circle to sort of the love of techno geekery from your youth. But at the same time, you're really taking kind of a designerly role here rather than just like banging out code, right? What you're trying to do is come up with the ideas necessary to develop things, right?
Yeah, I mean, coding just got a bit too hard, basically.
Yeah, I hear that.
I don't think I was ever really that good a coder. I'm a bit more of a sort of jack of all trades. I can do a bit of everything, but I'm not really that great. I'm not that great an engineer. I'm not that great a musician. I'm not that great a DJ. I'm not that great a coder. I'm not that great a graphic designer or a filmmaker. But I can do a bit of each of those things, and I've been able to parlay that into some sort of mixed career. But coding got too difficult, and I figured it was better to have a team of people to help me implement those ideas, and finding those people and having a crew and managing those relationships and so on has been a whole story in itself. But my JammPro crew, I've got 3 guys who are the main engineers on it, and we get on really well, and they're great to work with. So that's, as I've got older, I've found I'm better at being able to hold those kind of groups together and, not let my ego piss people off and stuff. So that, that's one of the advantages of getting older. I think one's experience of people means that one can operate more in that way. So maybe that's why one tends to drift into a sort of manager, or the best job actually for anyone out there is being creative director. That's right. That's the best job. So you can just have a great time coming up with crazy ideas, and someone else has to do the hard work of coding them or making them happen.
Right, but I think actually though, one of the things that's important in what you do and what you bring to the game is being a jack of all trades. I feel like in modern society, the jack of all trades role is kind of treated like it's too bad you're that. If you really want to make a bundle, you have to specialize, right?
It would be sad if that was the case. I think these things pull and push simultaneously in opposite directions. And if you look at music, for example, there's a lot more people making music nowadays, right?
True.
And the roles that used to be, for example, writer, composer, arranger, singer, engineer, producer, remixer, DJ, mastering, manager, live performer, I would suggest
that's all called an electronic musician now, right?
Yeah, it for many people that's coalesced, and you'll find at least some of those roles, some people doing some or all of those roles. And right. I think it's good. I mean, for me, it's meant I continue learning. I'm still learning all the time because I'm not very good at anything. So there's still a lot to learn.
It's funny. You're very good at sort of putting yourself down, but I think anybody that looks at your history of accomplishments would beg to differ. Now, unfortunately, our time is already long up, but I don't give a crap because this has been a great conversation. But before we go, you mentioned earlier that you're kind of getting involved in more activism. And I would say that there has been, over the years, the music that Coldcut has produced has often had kind of a political edge to it. Being in the UK, you've got a lot of political turmoil of your own to have to wrestle with, but also with your feeling, your sense of wanting to be engaged in things like ecological preservation and stuff like this puts you in a position to sort of have a global political view as well. I'm curious, from your perspective, how effective can artists and musicians be in the realm of activism and politics, and what for you represents a concrete way of pursuing that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, and one that we do get asked, can music really be political? I do believe that art and music can have a political and socio-political meaning and some weight to them, and there are many examples. So we do get often asked that, and it's like, hello, come on, look at the history and you will see good examples of that. Off the top of my head, I could mention Banksy, who I rate as a seriously brilliant artist and social commentator. I could mention John Hartfield, who invented political photo montage. I could mention Pink Floyd and Roger Waters and The Wall, which has a pretty clear agenda of leave the kids alone and let people think for themselves and fuck off, you fascist bastards. I could mention Sun City and the role of Artists Against Apartheid and Rock Against Racism in helping make it not very cool to be a racist and changing what they call the political discourse, changing the needle so that, in fact, people wake up one day and realize, I'm not down with those old-fashioned attitudes. I'm with acceptance, and I'm prepared to put my hand up and say, yeah. Greenpeace are an organization I work with quite often. Our piece Timber became a bit of an anthem for them. That is about deforestation, and that such things affect people. I just had an interview with Maceo Plex, who's a well-known tech house DJ and producer. As a young guy working in a record store, he heard our piece Timber, and he thought it was really cool, and it helped launch him into making music himself, but it also introduced him to ideas of deforestation and conservation. So I just heard that the other night from him. So sometimes one doesn't know what effect one's work's going to have. But I think art and music should be about something. A funky beat and exciting noise is all very well, but for me, I like it to be about something. And what could be more important than the world we live in, the environment we live in? Politics is the air that you breathe. It's the bus that you wait for. It's the truck that is poisoning you. It's the guys in the city making 100 million out of another coal power station, which then gives your grandkids asthma. Everything is connected, and it's a fitting focus to bring that up to the surface and shine some light on it and be aware of it and be amongst it.
Fantastic. So true. So true. Unfortunately, our time is well up, but before we go, I'd like to just kind of fill people in on where to go to check things out, and especially with this new release of both the JammPro, but also the Zen delay. Where would people go to find out more about this stuff? Is there a lot of like YouTube videos and stuff that can kind of be introductions?
Yeah, there's a good intro video for the Zen delay and another one for JammPro. I think if you search there, you'll find them. There is jampro.net as well, which is a good sort of introductory resource. And probably we should have a page to pull all these things together. But yeah, it's out there. You'll find it. There's a nice video for the Zen delay that I made with the bug.
Oh, okay.
In Berlin. That's a pretty cool little video. And there's also some good YouTube videos demonstrating it as well. So hopefully people will enjoy those.
Sure. I mean, given all of the things that you've done and you continue to do, I'm wondering what is sitting on your workbench that might be getting done soon. You obviously have this Coldcut project that you're going to be releasing, but you must have like 17 other projects you're in the middle of too, right?
Well, as I said, I've concentrated the last couple of years on wrapping stuff up. There are some other things I could talk about which are out there now. One of them is an app called Bogus Order Pixie, which is a granular visual synthesis, which is another concept. There's the robbery video game, which we got out there as well. You have to jail the banksters to save the world.
Perfect.
And I've got some other stuff. But at the moment, I want to get on with using my instrument and enjoying it.
It's fantastic.
And like I say, trying to do some kind of granular positivity to help do something with the world's problems. Now that sounds very preachy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I want to be positive and contribute for benefit and have a good time. So that's enough to be getting on with.
Yeah, it sounds like a nice gig. I appreciate that. So, Matt, I want to thank you for taking the time to have this chat. It was really fantastic to talk to you.
Thank you very much for your support, Darwin. Big up to the community, my brothers and sisters. The geek did inherit the earth.
Yes, indeed we have, indeed.
So let's keep rocking.
Bye.
Rock on. Bye.
Many thanks to Matt for having the great chat. It was really interesting to kind of hear about his background, but also hear about his vision for the future and how he gets around making the apps that he does, how the team over at Coldcut, how they end up making their music, and just in general what is coming out of that neck of the woods. If you want to know more, you really should head over to coldcut.net. There you'll find information about their music releases, about their apps and applications, including the MIDI Evolve Max for Live device, which is really pretty cool. They have stuff on AV concepts and even more information on political activism. So it's a good place to go and kind of check out a lot of the stuff that we talked about during this discussion. Also, before I go, I want to mention that there was a little bit of extra stuff that Matt wanted to describe. It was basically a thank you and a call to action for the world of pure data. So if you're into that or you want to just check out Matt's feelings about working with PD, head on over to the Patreon site. That's patreon.com/DarwinGross. And it'll be posted there for everybody to listen to. It's not going to be limited just to patrons. It'll be available to everybody, but head on over there. But also, if you are up for becoming a patron, it would really be appreciated. I thank those who are already patrons, and I would ask you to consider doing so as well. With that, I'm going to leave it to you until next week. Thank you so much. Enjoy. Have a great one. Bye.